Hello, everyone. Part two of the Bible study by the Catholic Way. My name is Serene. Part one was from the beginning of Genesis. We're still continuing on Genesis, but part one was about the beginning of Genesis, whereby we started with Adam and Eve, and we moved all the way down to Noah and his three sons as they had went through the flood. The water receded, and they parted in their separate ways to colonize all over the earth. Now, hundreds of years have passed, and Ham's descendants had become very successful as they had built cities in Africa. And they decided, no, they are going to build this giant tower to reach all the way up into the sky. So they built these great cities, and one of the cities was called Babylon. So God watched them deciding about building this great tower to reach the sky. And he watched them from the heavens, and he decided that he will punish them and forbid them from completing this tower by confusing them by speaking different languages and scattering them throughout the earth. So they could not communicate to complete their tower. Now, after the Tower of Babylon, there was a man called Terah. He was a descendant of Shem. Now, he had a son. One of his sons was Abram. He also had two other sons. Haran was his other son, and Haran had a son named Lot. Now, when Abram was born, he was born in a place called which is today known as Iraq. And that was around 2000 BC. Now, Abram's brother Haran, when he died, his son Lot went to go and stay with Terah, and Abram married Sarai, which is known as Sarah today. And Sarai was this beautiful woman. So they all moved together. They started traveling towards Canaan with his father and Lot, all their belongings, their wives and servants. So they first landed in a place called Haran. It's modern day Syria. That's where Haran is today. And there, Terah passed away at the age of 205 years old. That's when God then decided to call on Abram. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 to 3, God said to him, "Go out of your country, from your family and from your family's house, to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a new nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So now, Sarai was barren. She could not conceive children at this point. So he might have been a bit confused. No one knows, but imagine this guy is quite an age. They've traveled for years. And this man is quite an age, and his wife cannot conceive children. So he must be wondering, where on earth is these blessings coming from? Where am I going to be this great nation? Because I'm alone with my wife, you know? Imagine what he was going through, this old man. So at first, he trusted God at first. And then he says yes to God. And then he moves his wife, his nephew, and his servants and belonging and their cattle. And he listens to God and he leaves for Canaan, which is modern day Israel today. So then God makes him covenant with Abram. 3 promises. In chapter 15, God, God lets him know that in the time of Moses, God led his people to the promised land, as you know, right? So Israel today is known as Canaan then. So God makes this covenant with Moses as well, just like he did with Abram. And Moses is Abram's descendant. Just like God makes David a mighty king of the Jews, God says in his 3 promises to Abram, the first thing he says, he gives him all the land he can see, as far as the sands go, the whole of Canaan. And then he promises him that there will be a great nation. His descendants will become a great nation. And kings of his great nation, his descendants, David, as you can see, what happens with David. David becomes the king later on, the Jewish king. And Abram starts the Jewish faith in the Bible. He is the chosen one to start the faith. But before he gets circumcised and all that happens, he's still called Abram as he's still making his way through the journey of life to follow God. He spent his entire life traveling, following God's orders, what God told him to do. And sometimes he would lose a bit of trust in God, like you will see just now. Because on his way to Canaan, he sees that there are people starving. There's no food. There's full famine wherever he sees. So he starts to lose a bit of trust in God, in God's promise that we will have this promised land. So he decides to go off to Egypt with his family and not continue on to Canaan. And there, before he went, he built an altar and invoked God. Now in Egypt, the ruler of Egypt is a pharaoh who thought he was like God. He would just take any beautiful woman in Egypt who he felt that he must have, and he would take for his own. So on his way into Egypt, he says to his wife, "Please say therefore that you are my sister, and that we will go well, and they will not have any harm on my life and spare me. And they will take you because, you know, she was this most beautiful woman. And the Pharaoh always had to have the best woman in Egypt. Now, after they arrive, the Pharaoh hears about this beautiful woman and he sends his servants to fetch her. But before he fetches her, he pays a dowry. He offers Abram herds and herds of flocks of sheep, cattle. He offers him male and female servants, slaves. He offers him jewels, all the wealth he could give him. And Abram quietly hands over his wife and collects all these gifts. And with these gifts, there's a bit of a surprise, as you will see just now. Now, here God proves that he keeps his promise to Abram, even though he sinned. Remember what God had promised him. I will bless you. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. So God sends a plague to Pharaoh and his household. Now, he had no choice but to release Sarah. He released her and returned her. And he asked him to please leave. But he left all this wealth and gift that he and the servants, male and female, that he had bestowed upon them for dowry. So now Abram was now a very wealthy man. Now God did not leave Abram unpunished. Abram left Egypt with his servants that he was given. And one of his servants was Hagar, the same servant later that will cause him to sin later on. If Abram had just listened to God and he had stayed in Canaan, he would have avoided meeting Hagar in the first place. And if he had just fully trusted God. But Abram, the father of Israel, was the first person to spread the idea of the belief of one God. God commanded him to leave his birthplace and to go to that land, right? So this bond between the people of Israel and their land was reaffirmed to succeeding generations to the son of Isaac and his grandson Jacob that will come later. So off he went back all the way to a place called Bethel, where he made a second altar near Bethel. And he invoked God and he spoke to God. And God again had granted him a covenant, blessed him with great riches, and blessed him with nations, descendants of nations. So, and everything God had promised him had been fulfilled today. So now, when he invoked God for the second altar, remember he was with his nephew Lot, right? They had traveled back from Egypt as well. So Lot was also with him. So there he was invoking God, and God promised him, as I said earlier, promised him everything he had promised him before. Now, Lot had seen all this wealth they have, and the herdsmen, the workers, started quarreling about the cattle and so forth. Quarrels would break out. And Lot wanted success. He was ambitious. He wanted to achieve more than his uncle. So he asked him if he could leave with his wife, servants, herdmen, and all his belongings and settle on the opposite direction from him, in the Jordan plain, in the land that was far better than where he was. But unfortunately, this land is just outside of Sodom. So off Lot goes with his family. You will see in chapter 13 in the book of Genesis. So Lot and his wife and his servants, they settle in Sodom towards the east. Now Sodom and Gomorrah is the same place that you have that God destroyed. So that's where he was. And these were the most vile cities on earth. It was like there was prostitution and all types of sin. And this man is supposed to be a holy person. He goes and stays right in the middle of it. So Abram stayed with his people in Canaan. He continued to stay there this time and not leave. So then God blessed Abram and promised all the land that he could see again. So now the people in Sodom continued to be even more wicked as time went, which angered God. So when God was promising Abram in chapter 13, in chapter 13, verse 1 to 4 and verse 16, God said, "Look about you, and from where you are, gaze to the north, the south, the east, and the west, and all the land you can see. I will give you and your descendants forever, and I will make your descendants like dust on the earth. From anyone that could see the dust on the earth, your descendants too might be counted." What a great promise God bestowed on him. "Set forth and walk about to the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you." Now, end quote. Now imagine this man is like he's around his 90s. And this man is so old. He doesn't have any children. Picture yourself if that was you and your wife, and you were in your 80s, 90s, and you hear this voice promising you all that. Imagine what was going through this poor man's mind. So understand his situation. He was very faithful to God. I don't think any of us would have the courage that Abram had. We should actually admire his courage, that he spent so many years since he was a young man traveling throughout the deserts, trying to find this land in Canaan, traveling to Egypt and back, and all the while praising God. So you must commend this man. He was really an awe of a person to be able to do that. So when he did fall slightly, it's understandable. He's only human. I mean, how many of us would sacrifice everything and just follow God the way he did? That's why God honored him, I suppose, the way God did, and his descendants. So Abram then moved to Hebron. There he built another altar for God in chapter 13. Now there was a war brewing with Sodom and Gomorrah, right? There were these 4 kings. And these kings decided to fight amongst each other, right? So they decided, these 4 kings joined forces against the 5th king in the valley of Siddim. and they went into battle against them. And the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Some in the pits, some of the people fled in the pits, and some fled into the mountains. So the king who won this war claimed all of Sodom and Gomorrah and all its possession and its people, taking with them Abram's nephew Lot, as well as his possessions. So poor Lot, that had all this wealth, if he had just trusted in God and stayed with Abraham and obeyed God, he wouldn't have went through all this anguish he went through, and there's more anguish to follow. So Abraham went with 318 men to rescue Lot and retrieve Lot's possessions and his people. Now, when the king of Sodom heard that, he said this to Abram, "Give me the people and the goods you may keep." But Abram replied to the king of Sodom, "I have sworn to the Lord, God Most High, that the creature of heaven and earth, and I would not take so much as a thread of my sandal strap from anything that is yours, lest you should say, I made Abram rich, nothing for me." Now his name was still Abram, right? Abram. I'm saying Abraham for people so they don't get confused with the story. So, off God's voice, God spoke to him again in chapter 15 to Abram. And he said, "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield, and I will make your reward very great." So, no matter what, still God is standing close to him and protecting him. I mean, this is an old man, and yet he's so brave that he could go and rescue his nephew the way he did. So God again said to Abram in chapter 15, "Look up into the sky and count the stars. If you can, just go. That's how your descendants shall be." So Abram placed his faith back again in God. And God said, "I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldean to give you this land as my possession." When the sun had set and it was dark, there appeared a smoke blazer and a flaming torch, which passed between these pieces. It was that occasion that the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river." So there again, God makes a covenant promising him all this well. So Sarai said to Abram, now Sarai was growing anxious because she didn't seem to have faith that God will bless her with a child. She started doubting. So she said to him, "The Lord has kept me from bearing children. Have intercourse then with my maid. Perhaps I shall have children through her." Now she's talking here of Hagar. So he did take her as his concubine, and and she became pregnant. And afterwards, Sarah now felt that she was unworthy. So Sarah started fighting with her and rejected her and told her that she's responsible for the outrage. And it was normal in those times for people to have surrogate bearers or concubine wives if their wives could not conceive. It was completely normal in those days. So Abram tells Sarah, your child, your maid is in your power. Do with her whatever you wish. With that, Sarah then abused her so much that Hagar ran away. And the Lord sends a messenger by the spring in the wilderness to speak to Hagar. And the messenger said to her, Hagar, maid of Sarai, where have you come from? And where are you going? And she had answered, I'm running away from my mistress, Sarah. And that was in chapter 16, verse 7. So then he says, excuse me, go back to your mistress and submit to her abuse treatment. I will make your descendants so numerous that they will be so many to count. So the Lord messenger said to her, you are now pregnant, and you shall be a son, and you shall name him Ishmael. For the Lord had heard you, and God had answered you. So off she went back to Sarah, and she bore a son, and his name was Ishmael. And when he was born, Abraham was 86 years old. So that is quite old, imagine. So as Ishmael started growing up, Sarah became jealous. So Sarah became jealous of this child. 13 years later, God appeared to Abram for his name changing and his covenants. So in chapter 17, God asked him to circumcise himself and all the males in chapter 17, verse 4 to 9. States, my covenant with you is this: you are to become the father of the host of nations. No longer shall you be called Abram, but you shall be called Abraham. For I am making you the father of the host of nations. I will render you exceedingly fertile. I will make nations of you. Kings shall stem from you. That's very important. Words, kings shall stem from you. King David, Jesus. And then he says, I will maintain my covenants for you and your descendants after you throughout the ages as an everlasting pact, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. I will give to you and your descendants after you the land to which you are now staying, the whole of Canaan, which is now today, as you know, Israel. And then it continues. As a permanent possession, I will be your God. God also said to Abraham, on your part, you and your descendants after you must keep my covenant throughout the ages. This is my covenant to you and your descendants. Every male among you shall be circumcised. So then God also says in chapter 17, verse 11, circumcision shall be the mark of the covenants between you and me. So that's what God said. And then in chapter 17, verse 12, God then said, when a boy is 8 days old, he shall be circumcised. He then stated, if a boy is not circumcised, then he has broken my covenants. As for your wife Sarah, do not call her Sarai, call her Sarah. At that time, Sarah was 90 years old. Then Abram said to God, let but Ishmael live on by my favor. And this is in chapter 17, verse 19 to 22. Where he states about Ishmael, his covenant, and Isaac. Here he states, Isaac will maintain my covenant with him as an everlasting pact and be his God and the God of his descendants after him. He then states about Ishmael, I am heeding you. I hereby bless him. I will make him fertile and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 chieftains, and I will make him a great nation. Now here God declared his covenant stayed by Isaac and not Ishmael. And God says, but my covenants I will maintain with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear for you by this time next year, when he had finished. So he took his son Ishmael, the servants, and everyone, and had him circumcised. Now 3 angels then arrive in chapter 18. Then they come there and they serve them something. And they say to Abram, this time next year, Sarah will have a son. So God told him about the sin in Sodom and Gomorrah also. And he said that he's going to destroy all of them in Sodom and Gomorrah. So Abraham had a good point to God. In verse 33, he said, chapter 18, would he sweep away the innocent with the guilty? So God, he asked God, what if there were 50 innocents? And he went on and he dropped the number to 45 innocent. Would you spare them? What if there were 40? What if there were 30 innocent? Would you spare them? All the way down to 10, he said. Would you spare them? Then the angels arrived at Sodom. They asked Lot to leave with his family and don't look back. In chapter 18. Now, as they were going to destroy Sodom, they told Lot to flee to Zorah. But as the Lord torched Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot's wife made the ultimate mistake and she looked back. And that's when God turned it to a pillar of salt. Now, Lot had 2 daughters that he was fleeing with. And Lot moved with these 2 daughters up into the mountains. Then the old one, the eldest, said to the other one, Why don't we take turns sleeping with our father to conceive as there's no men around? This is in chapter 19, verse 31 to 36. So here they sin again. So they make Lot drunk, and the eldest daughter sleeps with him, and thereafter the following evening, his youngest daughter sleeps with him. And later, both of them conceive a child. But these two sons they conceive, they become the enemies of the Jews later on, their descendants. So Abraham moves to the town between Kadesh and Shur. In chapter 20, here he did it again, and he asked his wife to pretend to be his sister yet again. So the king took Sarah away again. Another king took Sarah away. And God then threatened the king in a dream. And he tells him that Sarah is married and he must return her, or else these people will die. When confronted by Abraham, what Abraham said, that she was his sister and they must share the same father, just different mothers. When confronted him, he said, yes, she is my sister. They just share the same father, but they have different mothers. So he used that as an excuse to lie to the king. So the king returned Sarah and gifted him gifts and land. And now Abraham received even more wealth, another dowry. After Isaac was born, Abraham circumcised him 8 days later, and Abraham was now 100 years old. Now Ishmael, Sarah chased Hagar and his son away, and God watched over him and promised Hagar that he will become a leader of great nations. And Ishmael grew up and he married and became an expert bowman, as well as very wealthy later on. So God then asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac as he grew older. So Abraham took Isaac, tied his son up on an altar that he made, and then he pulled out a knife to slaughter his son for God. And then God's messenger stopped him and asked him to slaughter a ram instead. And God redeclares the covenants of countless descendants. And that is the wonderful story of Abraham. We will continue with part 3, as Abraham's story was quite long. So we'll continue with part 3, going on to Isaac's story and his sons. Have a wonderful day further. Goodbye.